Hi everyone, welcome back. We are back for another episode and with a recurring guest, our friend Brandon Martin, that's joined us here today. So hello Brandon and welcome back for another pretty interesting topic. So thanks and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me back on. It's been a while since I've been on the air, and this is a great topic and great time for me to talk about this topic. So I've been doing a lot of research into the history of anarchism, which is something that we're going to be talking about today, and very excited to be talking with you again. I love coming on your show and doing these types of discussions with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you back on. And as you said, we are going to discuss the anarchistic thought and ideal through history. So that should be quite interesting. And before we go on, I would recommend people after watching this episode to maybe check out our previous episode that we did on anarchy and esoteric knowledge, because I feel that's something quite important to keep in mind when talking about anarchy in general, because we try to bridge the gap a little bit between those two areas that are fundamental for understanding and hopefully achieving human freedom. So I suggest people listen to that one also. But yeah, for starters, I'd say, why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about maybe the origins of this of the anarchistic ideal, because people usually when talking about anarchy, they think about the modern era mainly. However, that's a more ancient, even a more ancient idea. So if you want to go back and talk a little bit about the origins of it.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as what we consider to be anarchism, two main proponents or considered to be the godfathers of anarchism would be like Godwin. Godwin would be one, and then Proudhon, which a lot of people consider to be the godfather of it, to be the first dedicated anarchist, because he kind of brings in the ideas of destroying the church, destroying the state, and destroying any form of hierarchy in all systems. He kind of unifies all these three things together, where Godwin wasn't really doing that, though Godwin does have a lot of, anti-hierarchical ideologies. But yeah, when we talk about anarchism, we have to understand that its roots are an ideological root. It's an axiomatic root, which is, just simply about freedom. And this goes back to totemic sociology. It goes back all the way to the origins of mankind. As soon as we started to have resistance against freedom, we had a fight back or a pushback against that kind of oppressive force that was, starting to manifest itself, whether that was just individually out in the fields or in a social group. A lot of people would just look at it in the social workings of like the tribes and how we start to see hierarchies build. So we have stateless societies prior to state societies, obviously. This is, common history. These stateless societies were more based around what I would consider to be an esoteric religion, a totemic religion, and pre-totemic religions. And what I mean by that is that they have some sort of magical or, spiritual ideas that they're incorporating within their social structures. They're using the ideas of spirituality. And we can see some of these ideas, still today in many native cultures all around the world, in Japan, in the indigenous cultures of America. They're still practicing a lot of these totemic rituals and rites, and we'll see that a lot of these things exhibit the same principles that anarchism exhibits, which is voluntarism, mutualism, non-coercive authority, a respect for themselves, a respect for other people, a respect for nature and their environment that they're living in, you know. And what happens is that as we start to struggle with resources, mainly, we have a big competitive or an unhealthy competition of the gathering of those resources and the preventing of other people from having those resources. And this is where it all comes down to, is really the issue of property and how we define property and what property is. Whereas in totemic societies, we had concepts of property. Obviously, individual autonomy was a concept of property, obviously, and there was inheritance property as well. So I can give a couple examples. Obviously, a lot of people will think of anarchism dating back to, you know, maybe Hellenistic Greece time period, just because the word is a Greek word, which means no masters or no rulers. But you can actually take it back to Egyptian as well, or Comedian. So an example of this would be like, well, here's one. Here's a good example of this. So we have the Egyptian mythology of Ma'at, which is the goddess of truth, balance, and justice. A lot of people look at Ma'at as the, the divine aspect of natural law. And this kind of ties in with anarchism, because the idea here is that anarchism simply is about, not violating other beings. And if you end up doing that, then Ma'at will judge you. If your heart is heavier than the feather on the scales of justice, then you must be, deemed, unworthy for the next life or something like this. This is how that would come about. And then you have, where is his name? I have his name. Pahotep or Piotep. And his name, for example, his idea was that he was actually a pharaoh, but he exhibited ideas of autonomy within the system. And he was actually fighting against a lot of the religious and a lot of the state apparatuses working with the people. So you can look into that. That's dynastic Egypt time period, so that's not pre-dynastic. But he's a really good example of this, because in his story with the hieroglyphs, the story that we have from the hieroglyphs that we read, it shows that he's exhibiting this anarchistic thought very early on, where he actually doesn't like the position that he's in of rulership as a pharaoh. So he's kind of like what we would call the philosopher king or the wise king, like Arthur from the Arthurian legend, So this is a very early remnant of that. But there's also other examples. We see it with Diogenes in the Greek period. We see it with Zeno. We see it with Epicurus. There's a lot of anarchistic thought in the Greek time period. Epicurus is a really good example of like Gnostic autonomy thoughts, self-governance, things like this. If you read his philosophy, his books, then you're going to see that. And even though it's not called anarchism, even at that time period, it is still the roots of the idea. It's the idea of challenging the status quo, challenging any forms of authoritarian structure, challenging the idea that other people get to dictate by decree or by arbitration your life and what you do with your body and what you do with your property. So I think those are some good examples of early anarchistic thought, especially with totemic sociology. You can look at any indigenous culture and you will find that they have these ideas of self-ownership. Even though a lot of people would say they don't have any concept of property, there's an inherent principle of property that is being exhibited within the behaviors of the sociology between these people, right? So like if you look at Native American cultures, there is a concept of property. The inheritance property, that's there. The property of personal possessions. You can't take the shirt off of another, Native American or whatever, they might be wearing. Their headdresses, their gowns, their headdresses, very important. You don't just go to the chieftain and take his headdress. He understands that is his property, even though they don't have a formulated system of property as we would look at it today, or or some of the issues that we're going to be talking about, which is like collectivism and collective property, which I'm very excited to get into with you. So yeah, I think those are really good early examples.
Yeah, and it's very important also about the fact that, as you said, societies were stateless before they became, state-run, and because that's actually something that is being used to sort of, disprove or debunk the idea that we could become a stateless society again, because it's associated with the fact that that society then became more complex, how they say, and so we needed some form of, I mean, they usually try to use some euphemism, so societal organization, but actually what they're really saying is some form of coercion, so
that's absolutely correct and very well said.
But they say, okay, so we, as societies become more complex, obviously we have, more complex problems, etc. It becomes more difficult to organize, to protect our property and resources, as you said. So that means we can't be, stateless again, ever.
So. Right, which is a complete fallacy, because they had already dealt with these at a smaller scale, but they were still dealing with those problems without the need of coercive force being used. Really what this is man trying to arbitrate himself as God. That's really what it comes down to. It's man trying to become the ruler of other men on this planet. And what I mean men, I mean male and female, obviously, using it in the classical way. But yeah, I mean, all these ancient totemic societies had a form of egalitarianism, cooperative mutualism, mutual aid with each other. They understand stewardship, stewardship to each other and stewardship to themselves and their environment. So the individuals work to maintain some kind of social order. And even though we think of stateless societies colloquially as an unorganized grouping of individuals, is actually extremely the opposite, is very organized, very well put together. And there's many examples of stateless societies that came throughout the histories. There was stateless societies that existed in Ireland for like thousands of years, way after we had civilization arising with the, revolutions of agriculture and all this stuff. And they lived just fine, Yes, they eventually turned into some form of monarchy or, aristocracy eventually, obviously, but the monarchy did come up eventually. But mainly what happened is these coercive forces started to invade and poison that well, you could say, that well of ideas, which is kind of interesting. Just as a side note here, that we do have, I think it's called the Declaration of Armatha or Armana. I think it's a declaration that's like one of the most. There's more words in this than any other declaration, which was actually a declaration against authoritarian, regiments and regimes and authoritarian force being used. And the founding fathers of America actually took a lot of these ideas from this declaration and put it into the Declaration of Independence, which is kind of interesting. So they were very well educated, coming from British education, European education, obviously, and they were taught about this very early on. And they took some of these ideas of self-governance and autonomy and brought them here. So it's kind of interesting because it kind of comes from the Irish ideas there. There's like a direct lineage there. I could be pronouncing the name incorrectly for the declaration, but I'm pretty sure it's like Armara or Armartha, something like that. And people can look this up and source it,
Yeah, interesting. And also regarding the founding fathers, I think it was Jefferson that said that there was, one type of society would be the stateless society, like the Native Americans, like he was observing in the Native Americans. However, again, he pointed out that there were few usually, and he said we are too many for that kind of society. So you sort of see the maybe the fallacy in that reasoning, thinking that the more we are, the more coercion is needed. and the more the collective has to, swallow the individual. However, I think that's fallacious. I actually think that as as society actually is comprised of more and more people, then it becomes even more important to have more personal freedom. So,
yeah, it's kind of interesting to me that we have this idea, this notion that if there's more people, we have to use more violence against them to keep them under control. Because what's that coming from? That's coming from fear. It's coming from fear that there's more danger. There's more potential for these people to take things that are yours or all this stuff, right? And then what you do is that now I'll just take what's theirs, right? You just reverse it. You're like this social Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest and the survival of the most ruthless. It's like, I'm going to become the most ruthless. I'm going to be at the top of the pyramid. I'm going to take everything. If I'm in that position, I'm good. My family's good. Fuck everybody else, pretty much. So.
Yeah. So, we talk about some of the more ancient ideas that can be defined, anarchistic. And you also mentioned, William Godwin, sort of one of the proto-anarchists, as he's referred to. So I don't know. Do you wanna? Shall we jump back a little bit into the future, or did you have some other historical periods that you wanted to cover, maybe?
Yeah, I'll add one other ancient example. The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu is really important to understand. So the Eastern examples of anarchism go back, tens of thousands of years, if not even further, and we can date them. You can see this, you can look it up. But yeah, there was stateless societies over there. If you look in Japan, there's all kinds of versions of anarchism that were, pre-Meiji period, Westernization, I would say, because there's a lot of Westernization that takes place. But the Taoist concept of like Wu Wei is a total anarchist idea. They call it non-action, but I believe that's kind of like a mistranslation of it, because it's not about non-action. Because you see that they do exhibit these ideas of action. It's just that's the term that we use for that translation, because it's hard to translate other languages sometimes, right? But it's a rejection of the social that the society requires external authority to dictate you. That's like the philosophy of that. And this authority comes in many different ways: how you use your body, what food you can grow, whatever it might be, how you can acquire property. So I think that's a really good example of early anarchist ideas as well.
Yeah, I think that's quite important, the Lao Tzu's writings. And yeah, the fact about non-action, maybe also, it could also be, something that we often say, that instead of trying to do more and more new things to get to, the result that we want, maybe oftentimes we have to do less. We start participating less in the, in the systems, in the system, or in some other, immoral societal structure or something like that. So
yes,
maybe it's about more about withdrawing consent rather than doing a whole load of new things.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment of that. That's how I would say you're supposed to interpret the idea of non-action. Whereas colloquially, a lot of people, like Western philosophical minds, will think of it as, pacifism, like don't do anything, right? And that's not what it means. It just means withdrawing your energy into that specific system or that specific energetic pool, you could say. Here's another interesting thing that I have in my notes here, just as another early example of anarchist ideas, which we will see this play out later on, like the Industrial Revolution and the labor movements. There was a society in Egypt called the Shinnu Society. And this was a group of skilled workers, of masons, early ideas of masons. They organized themselves into what would consider to be like a labor union of, dynastic Egypt. And they were trying to fight against the ideas of the slave labor system that was going on in dynastic Egypt at that time period. So it's very similar to the 19th century labor movements, right? So the Shinyu Society also has a correlation to French, which is the cartouche, I believe is what they call it. Maybe you can correct me if I'm mispronouncing that, but which is, it's also like if you look in the hieroglyphs, you'll find this this name as well in the hieroglyphs, the cartouche, or Shinnu is the name actually, and it's an Egyptian god or person of sovereignty. They mistranslate it to royalty, but it's actually sovereignty, a person who governs themselves. So it's really interesting. So yeah, the Shinnu, so Shin actually means encompassing. So it means it's a symbol of organization, it's a symbol of the circle, the round table, people coming together. And it was a magical concept as well, but they were using this mythology to kind of push forward their fight back against the inequality of the way that the royals were using their labor in that society in that time period. And I would also say that most likely a lot of the early totemic tribes actually kind of knew the dangers of what we're going to talk about later, which would be socialism and communism and things like this. They understood the dangers of like collectivism at that level because it degrades the individual value and the individual autonomy. And they would seek to place contingencies against that within their mythologies, within their symbolism and stuff like that. So it's really important to understand that we did have like early concepts of these collective property ideas. And I use the quotations because in reality, there's really no such thing as that. So we can have like shared stewardship of things, but collective ownership of things is a very, very dangerous ideology. Very, very dangerous ideology. But yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. It's a good example of like unions being created earlier on than what we thought of as like the unions of labor in Europe and in America.
Yeah, that's the issue of collectivism and communism and socialism. It's quite important when talking about the history of anarchism, because we'll see that maybe in more modern times there was many of these anarchistic ideals and were sort of were merged with or compromised themselves with the collectivist ideal and with more socialistic and communistic ideals. So I think that's kind of one of the main problems we've got with the whole anarchy, with the anarchist movements in general, and up to today, up to contemporary era.
I would agree with you on that. We see the dichotomy between the left-wing anarchism and right-wing anarchism, where we could look at like left-wing anarchism as Marxism and socialism. Examples of this would be like anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, black book anarchism or black bloc anarchism, and Antifa. We have these movements which are extremely left-wing, which is all about the abolition of private property, wage labor, collective, and the implementation of collective ownership and the means of production in goods and services, obviously. So, and their root fundamental focus is always an attack against capitalism. It's never a specific attack. It's an economic structure, obviously, capitalism, right? So we have to understand it's never a specific attack against the belief in the erroneous dogmatic ideas of authority, you know? So it's specifically about the hierarchical structure of capitalism. And capitalism actually wasn't a term for a long time. It was just considered to be free markets is what originally it was supposed to be. And then we start to see this, you know, this idea of capitalism arising and I'd say early 18th century and moving forward, you know, that term, we start to see it really coming about. But yeah, we can start off if we want to. We can look at Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and he publishes his book, What is Property, which kind of inspires Marx. You know, Marx bases a lot of his ideas off of this writing. He diverges from Proudhon, but we have this fundamental idea with the statement property is theft in this book, in this writing, which is one of the fundamental flaws of it's not a mistranslation, but it's a misinterpretation of what that actually means. So Proudhon was actually specifically talking about the way that the social structure was built and how whenever you start to collectivize these ideas of property, it becomes theft of the individual. And he talks about that in his book, and a lot of people overlook that. And there's like 3 different ways he defines it, and it's very ambiguous. It's hard to like really pull it out.
He's an ambiguous guy.
Yeah, he's very ambiguous. You know, it's like, what is this guy talking about? Because he contradicts himself. He contradicts himself so much in this idea, you know, with his published work, What is Property? And it's like, what is he talking about? He's all over the place. But you can see that these ideas are not solidified because we are in this time period of great turmoil around the entire world. You know, prior to World War I, we have all this crazy, you know, it's after the Renaissance, obviously, after the French Revolution. We have all these crazy things coming up with these ideas, you know, about how to deal with the society at hand across the entire world. And anarchists were at the forefront of this especially throughout the 18th century and 19th century. You see them at the forefront of every movement that starts to take place. And it's kind of like they were trying to do whatever they could, failing in many, many ways. And we can see that throughout history. But I feel like, because you mentioned anarchism gets overlapped with socialism and communism and Marxism at a certain point. And it's kind of interesting because we didn't have any kind of real collective examples of that, right? So we didn't have Marxist-Leninists at that time period, right? And it's like we didn't have a blatant example of how bad these things were. We only had an ideological concept of these things, or small incremental examples around the world, you know. There wasn't a huge military force being backed by this idea of Marxism that's coming in and starving millions of people and stuff like that, right? So you can understand that the anarchist mindset is, I have to gain sympathy as much as possible for my movement, so we're compromising on a lot of our principles, which is where we ended up failing. This is the repetitive thing that we see throughout all anarchism, and it allows the venom of statism to start to seep into these concepts of the philosophical anarchists, you know, where we start to see them become more statist, and we see collectivism becoming more apparent, and then Marxism taking over everything about anarchism, you know, and Antifa and stuff like that. So I don't know if you have something you want to add into any of that.
I wanted to add that the thing with Marx, Marx clearly wasn't an anarchist, and he also, and people like Proudhon and Mikhail Bakunin stated that they actually were against Marx because he wanted a state, you know, a coercive state, and they were against, especially Bakunin was clearly against any form of coercive authority. But yeah, still remains the issue the fact, as you said, that they wanted this anarcho-communism, so-called, and even the dilemma about property is interesting because, well, even Proudhon at a certain point says that property was freedom, but intended in its real meaning, meaning that, I mean, he recognized that you didn't really own anything because there was a coercive power structure. So in order to have, he actually said that property could really exist only in what he calls an egalitarian society.
Yep, that's right.
And that's what people really overlook, and,
right.
And we see even today with all these issues that people people who are dissenters and what have you are really do have a problem with property, to the point that they declare that they want to abolish all private property. Actually, yeah. However, that I think even looking at looking at what these anarchists thought about property, on one side they were against, but on the other side they do recognize that you did have a right to have your own property. I think, yeah, they were, as we said, especially Proudhon, but even the others, they weren't that clear. They were pretty ambiguous in their statements regarding property, and also other things. Their attitude towards the terms socialism and communism, and so yeah, they were, as I said, they were ambiguous. However, it's not that when you go and read their writings, it's not that they are completely, for the complete abolition of personal property. So
right, exactly. After Proudhon died, we see that Bakunin really amps up his stance against this idea of the abolition of private property. And he really was, I mean, this guy was big, right? Not only physically, he's like 6'5". The guy was huge, but he's also big intellectually and revolutionarily, right? So he's an interesting individual, and we see that he plays a prominent role in organizing the anarchist movement in the late 1800s, like 1860s, 1870s, right? And let's see, we had the first international, right? The International Working Men's Association, which was founded in 1864. It was a combination between Marxists and anarchists who kind of came together and were trying to organize things. And this is kind of where we see this ideological battleground that takes place between Marxism and anarchism, specifically between the two prominent leaders, Marx and Mikhail Bakunin. And Mikhail Bakunin wrote and very relevantly, very abundantly declared the issues of centralized state authority through Marxism. He fought against that. And then Marx eventually, swayed the population of the International to exile the anarchists out of the International at a certain point. This was after the Paris Commune, obviously, after we had, and we can talk about the Paris Commune because I think that's a very important part of anarchist history, specifically because the state usually uses that as an example against anarchism, which is kind of funny because it was really the state that did the most damage in that situation, But yeah, we have the first International Working Men's Association that was founded, and anarchist thinkers were, trying to work together with these socialists and communists at this time period. Though Marx obviously had a lot of, which is very interesting. He has a lot of dark occult origins, with a lot of the money that backs what he does, especially him and Engels eventually, right? So there's a lot of nefarious things taking place behind the scenes with Marx. So yeah, I don't know if you want to take it from there.
Yes, well, there are, and we can see why. It's we can see why even today, with how where this, where all the governments are really going towards. It's really, if you think about it, it's really that ideology, one way or another, coming from different points of origin, like either communism or either socialism or national socialism. But that's the place where they converge. It's really the again, having the absolute power of the state, and just abolishing any sense of individuality and property, because starting from our bodies, which are not considered our property by the state. So and people don't really people think Marx probably had good intentions or something, and even all these communists had good intentions or something, but that just shows how people are not have been fooled, especially by the public education system, and don't really dig far enough into their backgrounds.
Yeah, I agree.
So they probably should have listened to the anarchists a bit more.
Right. I agree. It's interesting too, because there technically were more anarchists at that time period. They had more backing by the citizens than the Marxists did. But eventually that changed. That changed dramatically, which is interesting. And we can see that all these authoritarian ideas, they may differ in the way that they apply their system, the way that they approach their authoritarianism. But ultimately, it's the same goal. It's more centralization of authority. It's more control over the individual's autonomy and individual property, the production and distribution of property, goods and services, all that stuff, right? So yeah, I wanted to go back real quick. I had mentioned left-wing anarchism. Right-wing anarchism is a little bit more closer to what I think me and you agree on, though it's close, but it's no cigar, right? So
yeah, I would say there's the collectivist form of anarchy, and the individualistic form of anarchy.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you've got there's especially from the States, but also in Germany there was Max Stirner.
Yes.
And Tucker and Benjamin Tucker and Josiah Warren in the States. In the States.
Three of my favorites.
However, just to mention it, even the collectivist anarchists, to a certain degree, they recognize the importance. So again, in not just property, but also individualism.
That's right.
They probably said that it was exaggerated if you only went the individualist way, which I don't think so. However, they did recognize at a certain point also the importance of that. So
yeah, we have the Western philosophy of egoism, which is said to be Stirner's ideas of individualism, right? So that's where a lot of people, like we have egoists today, and they think Stirner is the father of this idea, and actually he wasn't that much really of an egoist as what people consider it to be today. It's a form of individualism, which should not be confused with what I would consider to be an unhealthy form of egoism.
Today one of the major issues I found today, it's the equation of individualism and pure egoism, which is quite dangerous and has done quite a bit of damage. Every blog that you read that is critical of this current system, they all bash individualism. They say that the situation that we are in is because we have this, there's so much individualism, and that's something that I highly, not agree with the dissenters of today.
It's like the complete opposite. It's really the collectivism.
Usually they say individualism and free market. They say those are the two main problems that we that we have today, and that have actually created the world of oppression that we live under.
Yes, which is
so,
ridiculous.
and I completely not agree with these points of view. So.
Yes, I agree with you. That is fundamentally flawed because we don't have those things going on technically. You know, we haven't had those things going on at a collective example. I don't think since we've had the state involved. Obviously, you can't have free markets when you have the state. You can't have individualism as a philosophy of a society when there's a state involved, because no matter what, states are always collective oriented. They'll always be collective oriented. So yeah, we have some examples here that I had written down. We have anarcho-capitalism, right? I would just consider it to be free marketism. And then you have like anarcho-agorism, and you have voluntarism, you know, and sometimes we see that logo with the A and the V with the yellow merged together. And most of these people, you know, they believe in free market economics, voluntary interaction, freedom of association. These things are things that I agree with as well. But they also leave out the fundamentals of objective truth, objective morality, natural law principles, and I would even say one of the most important things is some spiritual ideas, spirituality, some metaphysics, good metaphysics for them, right? As we see postmodernism running amok through both sides of these. You know, we see both sides, at least at the fundamental core of the postmodernist idea, which is that there is no such thing as objective truth. And that's the foundation of all of our philosophies. If we don't have an objective truth, then we have no means to start building any ethics or moral basis after that, you know, because there's no point in anything that comes after that. It's all subjective. It's all arbitrary. It all can be changed at the whims of the perception. And there's no means for justice that you can't have self-defense personally or self-defense in a society in any way, because it's just, you know, it's up in the air. You can do whatever you want with it. It's, you know, the victim has no power to defend themselves, and the abuser has all the power to continue to abuse. Is really how I would look at it. But those two examples. I just wanted to make sure to give that dichotomy. We have the left-wing anarchism. We have right-wing anarchism. They're both at some level fundamentally flawed, especially left-wing anarchism, because they both still have this idea of no objective truth. And they still have an idea of some form of authority, you know, running through it. So I consider these to be fake-ass versions of anarchism. They're not real versions of anarchism, you know, in the purest sense. By the nature and the virtue of what anarchism means, you know, by the philosophical virtue of what anarchism means, the ontology of it. So what I mean by that is fundamentally anarchism is always going to be rooted in the idea of individual ownership, you know, individual ownership, individual autonomy, and, you know, anything that gets put in there to try to, you know, muddy the waters, you could say, makes it not by virtue or by its nature what it originally was meant to be, you know. So I just wanted to kind of hammer on that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a dire need for anarchists to really get into, to really understand natural law and what a right is, and objective morality again, because when you have a comprehension of that, then all of the other differences between all the various currents are just differences in you know, basically in how you choose to live your life, whether individually or whether you're part of some community. So if you can respect the rights of others and you know, align yourself with natural law, you know, then really that's the, you know, the trait d'union, as they say in French, but the, you know, the unifying factor, you know, of basically, you know, people who want to live in freedom, people who love freedom and who say they want a better society. That's I think right. that can't really happen without understanding first principles and objective morality and rights. So
that's right. We have to have universals, is what I would declare them, which would be something that is immutable, it's inherent, and it does not change with time, place, or the perception of individuals, and that's what we mean by objective. We mean that we don't get to decide what a right is and what a wrong is. We discover that by correctly diagnosing the effect of the cause, being our behaviors. If this happens to violate another person, if this person is relieved of their liberty in some way or some form through a coercive force, then obviously it cannot be a right. There's a reason why we call them rights, because it also means correct, meaning the correct action, the correct answer. That's why we call them rights. So that's not just coincidence that we have that terminology, that rhetoric for what this condition is. So let's get back onto this journey of anarchism through history. So I would like to bring up the Paris Commune, because Paris Commune is a very early example of an attempt at abolishing the state. This was in 1871, and this is when it was briefly ruled, by the anarchists and the Marxists. I think this took place March 28th, 1871. It was done for 73 days. The Commune was the result of an uprising in Paris after France was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War, which took place. We have the French National Guard that had defended Paris, and the working class radicalism grew amongst its soldiers at this time period. So then we also have the establishment of the Third Republic and like right before this. So it was in 1870, the complete defeat of the French army by the Germans by March 1871. The soldiers of the National Guard seized control of the city on March 18th. They killed 2 French army generals and refused to accept the authority of the Third Republic. Instead attempted to establish an independent government at this point. And the anarchists played a key role in building this quote-unquote commune. And Mikhail Bakunin was there. Marx was there. There was, Mikhail Bakunin was one of the major key figures at this time period in this. And the anarchists were really interesting. So they actually had this idea of, helping the poor more so than the Marxists at this time period, which is interesting because the Marxists are supposed to be helping the poor, right? That's the entire thing. But when you look at the actual stories and the writings that were taking place, we have many examples that it was actually the anarchists who were out actually homing the poor, feeding the poor, helping the people who were sick, and things like this through voluntarism and this what we would call mutual aid, but not mutual aid in the communist sense or the socialist sense. When I say mutual aid, I specifically mean in an anarchist sense, because mutual aid can also be a socialist communist idea that gets thrown around, so I want to make sure I'm very clear about that.
Yeah, it's one of the selling points.
Yeah, right. They know the buzzwords very good, They know how to emotionally manipulate people very well by pulling on the heartstrings, because they know that when you are in a survival mindset, it's easy to manipulate you. If you're rooted in the R complex of the brain and you're thinking fight or flight, it's really easy to sway you with some good words, good words and a good image, which is funny because Marx actually was a very, very non-hygienic person. When you look at the writings of him, he was actually a nasty dude. Not that you're super hygienic back then, but comparatively to some of the other people, yeah, he was, there's many stories of like how he lived in filth and kind of funny. Just wanted to throw that in there, the filthy Marxist.
Well, he definitely reflects on the ideology, for sure.
Right. So some of the other key points of this is that even though these ideas that were of like anarchistic roots, its application was more of a communist or a social democracy at this time period, but not a democratic socialism. Those are two different things. It would be considered more social democracy than democratic socialism. And that a lot of people look at this as a mainly anarchistic ran commune, when in fact it really wasn't. They actually were being suppressed majorly, especially after they took it in those 73 days. There was a lot of issues that took place. There was even a conflict, if I remember correctly. I think it was called the law of hostages, or the law of something. I think it was called the law of hostages. I have it noted somewhere, but it was an arbitrary way that the Marxists set up, because they got the sway of the public at this point, that if you were anti-commune at all, it didn't matter, that we would execute you, and we would use you as an example. They would, technically. So, this is why this idea of the law of hostages was actually used against anarchism as propaganda, even though it was a Marxist idea, and Bakunin talked out against this law that was implemented at this time period. It's the law of hostages, or the law of suspects is also what it's called. So this was a decree enacted by the Paris Commune. And it says here, it took me a minute. This is actually, I wrote about this in my book on anarchism through history, and I'm in my chapter about that. So, okay, so at the heart of the law of suspects was a broad definition of what suspects would encompass. So any individual that was seen to be suspicious or deemed to be a threat to the commune, not just that they were anti-commune, but if they had any inclination that they were suspected of being an infiltrator or descendant against the commune in any way, they would be detained on suspicion alone. No due process, really. There's no real due process at this level. So this was kind of like almost a lynch mob that was going through the streets, and just rounding people up. There was a wave of arrests and detentions across Paris at this time period, and they were brought. This was supposed to be their due process. They were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and they were often faced with swift and harsh measures against them, which was called justice, even though many of these people were just innocent bystanders that other people were, being like, oh, that person did this, and they just said it, and it was hearsay, and the next thing you know, they're being hauled off by the police of that, right? So, which I would consider to be the Marxist police, obviously. So it was there was an emphasis on speed too. So they wanted to get them in the tribunal and out as fast as possible. There's a lot of conflict going on, obviously. So there's a lot of punishment, a lot of shame, a lot of social shame, a lot of social guilt that was taking place with this too. And it kind of reminds me of the whole Lenin thing, when if you stop clapping when Lenin left the stage, you better not.
I think that was Stalin, but.
Oh, Stalin. Yeah. You're right. Yeah, it's Stalin. Yeah. Thank you for the correction. It's Stalin. Yeah, if you stop clapping, then you're the one who's going to be pulled out by the police at that point. They're going to pull you out. They're going to make an example of you. So don't stop clapping. And yeah, that was Stalin. Sorry, my brain got clustered. History is so complex, and so.
But Lenin, however, we'll mention Lenin because.
Yeah, we have to mention Lenin.
We'll mention Lenin, definitely.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, this was like an ostensible way of safeguarding the revolution, of this Paris Commune. So the anarchists at this point, I had written about this. They were actually they had rising concerns about the law of suspects and the violation of fundamental rights, as the law authorized arrest and trial of individuals based solely upon suspicion and word of mouth, without any kind of due process or concrete evidence. And I think that's very important, because that's one of the major failures within this community, because they were just out there doing this, but they didn't really kill a lot of people. Not that they should be killing anybody in any sense. No, even one individual death of, unrightful means is not justified in any ways. But yeah, it's just it's a big example that's used against anarchism.
Yeah, and yeah, talking about going back to Lenin, I was about to mention all the Makhnovist movement in Ukraine. I think that's something many people don't know about, but something important in the history of anarchism.
Yes.
And because at the start of the Russian Revolution and then the Civil War that followed suit after that. So between like 1917 and the early 20s. We had in Ukraine, we had this movement coming up led by Nestor Machno, who became pretty much who became an anarchist in jail, I think, while incarcerated, and then he led. He formed a pretty large community over there in Ukraine, and it was successful for a while. Obviously, he had his ideas, obviously about property, that they didn't want property, supposedly, and they were he was self-proclaimed anarcho-communist, and however they pretty much had to fight both the conservative Russian troops, the whites, the reactionaries, and the Reds after a while, after not long after that, the Bolsheviks, because the Bolsheviks saw them as a danger for their ideas and the fact that they wanted decentralized communities, and
right.
they were basing their communities in the decentralized Soviets, as they called them, while the Bolsheviks obviously wanted to consider that even more dangerous than the whites, than the reactionaries. So they started persecuting the Makhnovists, and eventually Machno was defeated, and he had to go into exile, first in Poland, then in France, where he died, and he was buried in where some of the people, where some of the dead from the Paris Commune were buried also. So that's interesting. However, one thing I'd say is that he stubbornly wanted to be an ally of the Bolsheviks, even though he knew they'd eventually destroy them. He thought that the main threat were the Ukrainian nationalists and the white Russians, the reactionary army, and he insisted in maintaining this alliance with the Bolsheviks that eventually led to his demise.
Right.
So
yeah, it's interesting because we do see that amongst some other anarchists. I think Emma Goldman also was a defender of the Bolsheviks' approach to revolutionary change, though critiquing their ideas in many ways, but also supporting it. And I think what's his name, Peter
Kropotkin.
Yeah.
Kropotkin, yeah.
Yep. So
even though that they all had to escape from the Soviet Union, even
right?
Kropotkin, because he would have been killed there. And Lenin, Nestor Machno also talked with Lenin, and he was, he definitely wasn't happy with the result, because Lenin bashed anarchism and
right, it's interesting,
right in front of him, and so
yeah, there's like a speech of Lenin actually saying like our ideals are not different than the anarchists, and then he goes on to critique anarchism. And some anarchists at that point were like, oh yeah, Lenin, he supports us, right? And he's in support of anarchism, when in fact it was just Marxism in disguise, you know, and it's just Marxist-Leninism, you know, a little bit different than how Karl Marx would approach it, but obviously we see where it ended up. Those fundamental axioms ended up, you know, killing masses of people, obviously.
Oh, yes, and continuing, because you know,
yes, absolutely,
not over.
Absolutely.
But the interesting thing about Machno was what they call the anarchist army. That he created this army that was quite successful, especially in the beginning, but really right to the very end. Obviously, towards the end, it was starting to be, because they were forced out of their own territory, which they knew best, and that was the key factor in their, you know, military defeat. However, when they were fighting in their own territory, they kind of were, you know, they won a lot of battles against both the, you know, the reactionaries and the Bolsheviks. So, and they were decentralized in nature, so they were harder to. It was hard to just, you know, strike one city or one town and sort of decapitate the movement,
right?
Because they were so decentralized, and they had the support of many of the local people, like farmers, and so that's an interesting history, an interesting part of anarchist history, the one of, you know, the Machnovist movement and its army.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. I think it's a good point on self-defense. One thing. Yeah. Also, militia, you know, militias, which I would consider that a true militia, because that's a decentralized force of self-defense between local communities. And I think it's important to also point out that we had sympathy of people who were not considered to be revolutionaries. That's also very important, because it is about each other. You know, this is about each other, and that's really what we're getting to the root of the problem here, is that everybody is affected by statism, and the anarchists have, you know, at least attempted, maybe failed in many ways and maybe succeeded in many ways, but attempted to make a great individual and social change by standing against oppressive authority throughout pretty much all history. I always say this, that anarchists were at the forefront of every single revolution at some point, usually getting scapegoated and bastardized and marginalized at some level, you know, at least the revolutions that did actually make some change. I mean, we see that we have anarchists that were in support of the Bolshevik Revolution. We see that they were, you know, support of, they were all over the place, obviously. They were in, you know, the early labor unions, which would, you know, whatever that turned into, a monster. Obviously, it turned into a freaking monster. But yeah, I wanted to go back to the Paris Commune for one more thing here, and we can move on from there. As far as, you know, so what had happened is that we have the bloody week of the Commune, right? And this is when we had it was the brutal assault on Paris, leading to the bloody week. The Commune fought vigilantly against the overwhelming odds, but ultimately it was unable to withstand the superior firepower and manpower of the government forces that were coming in on May 28th, which is interesting because we know in the occult that May is a very significant time period, you know, from March to May Day. We know that May Day ended up being, you know, the communist high holiday. It's Walpurgis. Yep, and it's Labor Day. That's right. That's absolutely right. It's an old astrotheological, you know, totemic ritual because of the Sabbath. But supposedly, as far as what we know, the invasive state killed over 20,000 to 43,000 people that were taken prisoner at this time period, and some of them. So they killed over 20,000, and 43,000 people were taken prisoner. So the executions from even the Marxists, even though I am not a Marxist, were very, very scant in comparison to what the state did when they came in to stop this communion, this community. So I think it was in the double digits. I can't remember. I know I have it here somewhere. Very many people, and in comparison to 20,000 people being bloodily murdered, and most of these people were innocent people, that needs to be like pointed out, that the state was really the adversary of the anarchist movement. Even though the anarchists weren't in control of the complete commune, we still need to understand that they were still part of it. And this is something I always point out. You always get this argument from Marxists. It's like, oh, that's not my Marxism, right? That's not my communism, right? And it's like, look, anarchism is all over the place with its history. I can't deny its history. We failed in many ways. I'm not going to deny its history. I will tell you that some of the ideas there are rooted in the failures of anarchism, though we needed to evolve and solidify a more sound philosophy. I'm not going to deny those things that they have taken place, So we have Bakunin, who had to escape that, right? Escape this crazy
massacre,
this massacre, right?
Yeah, and that's a constant with in history with anarchists. They've always been, hunted for and massacred in some cases, like the Paris Commune, as you said, on the Russian Civil War, and the Spanish Civil War. So we had, those were three very, great massacres of anarchists. Many anarchists were just slaughtered, and mostly by those who were considered by them their allies.
Right. Absolutely.
Both as we've seen with the Soviet Civil War, with the Russian Civil War. They were mostly slaughtered by the Bolsheviks, and in Spain, they were mostly killed by the Republicans, who were they were called the Spanish Republic, but they were actually pretty much a communist, socialist communist state, basically.
Yeah, it's a repeating thing throughout history, and this is why we do have to learn history. And I wanted to mention that the state. It was the National French Army that started this invasion onto the commune. I just wanted to,
with the auspices of the invading German troops.
Right, that's right. And I think it all started like in the final days. The commune also executed the Archbishop of Paris, George Darboy, I think was his name. So he was that was like one of the 100 hostages that they had, and then that's the commune. They had around 100 hostages at that point, but the state killed 20,000 plus individuals. So yeah, it's a very notable point in anarchist history that is definitely not overlooked. It's definitely propagandized against us. So I think it's very important to understand what was taking place there. There was a lot of battles between the Marxists and the anarchists. The battle between Mikhail Bakunin and Marx was very crucial to this point. And then let's see here. Let's see. I have some more notes. We could go on, if you would like. We could go on to the May 4th Haymarket event, if you want to talk about that at all, which is kind of like the next big thing, or wherever you want to go.
Yeah, that's pretty important. Wasn't that one of the events that also led to like the declarations by all these governments, the anti-anarchist laws and these other things. Okay, so yeah, we can. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay, so we have it's interesting because a little modern, you could say a little modern media knowledge. May the 4th, we just passed May the 4th, right? And we use that in the Star Wars lingo,
Yes.
May the 4th be with you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this was a very crucial time period that nobody ever really remembers. So in 1886, you have the Haymarket Affair in Chicago, where anarchists and labor organizers were falsely accused of throwing a bomb at police officers during the protest, leading to the execution of several anarchists, but specifically a lot of individuals at that specific gathering on May the 4th were killed, especially women and children. But I think they gathered up 8 anarchists, and most of them weren't even at the market affair, you know, and they were trying to use them as a public image, you know, to derail the ideas of anarchism. 5 were sentenced to death, 4 were hanged, 1 committed suicide. And then later on, the anarchists were pardoned eventually, which was kind of interesting. Because they, you know, like they couldn't deny, because there was no evidence of these people actually being there. There was like all this, you know, controversy surrounding this. So yeah, one of the things that they were trying to fight for was better conditions in the work environment at this time. Rather than 12-hour work days, they wanted 8-hour work days, and that was like one of the Haymarket, you know, movements, is like trying to fight against the horrible work environments that they were in. But after this, you know, it was in France that we really saw the true effects of this event, like in Europe, specifically France, right? So it was later proven, just as a side note here, that there's a lot of document. I think there's enough evidence to say that the chief of the police in Chicago actually set up the idea and set up the plan as a false flag incident against the anarchists at that time period to set off that bomb and have a justification to come in and stop these movements and stop these protests that were taking place. So, you know, take it away.
Yeah, no, you're right, and it's funny. One of the many things with which, you know, history is repeated. You know, the infiltration at protests and demonstration, and then in order to shut them down. And it's interesting because during the time period we have like one of these first international, you know, alliances between all the heads of state and the rulers of the various countries against anarchy. That was defined the biggest danger, the gravest danger for, you know, order and civilization. So that's another important point. And I think it was what led to the creation of Interpol also.
It is,
if I'm not mistaken. So that's kind of probably maybe the first war on terror of a kind.
Yeah, as far as what I know, that's actually the first time that those terms were ever used publicly, which was against the anarchism that, you know, is the war on terrorism, or the war on terror.
Yeah.
You know, and you have this globalist idea that comes together to fight against the terrorism of anarchism, and then, like you said, they end up collectivizing to the point that they become the Interpol. That's way later on, but they do, and this is like the pre-ideas to this kind of global police force that we have, which is still going on today.
Also, we had some assassinations going on in that time. I think in 1900, U.S. President McKinley was assassinated by somebody who was associated with movements. Then it came out he really wasn't. However, there were some anarchists that killed some heads of state, like the Spanish prime minister was killed by an Italian anarchist.
Yes.
Another Italian anarchist killed the French prime minister Carnot. And Umberto, King Umberto II in Italy was killed by Gaetano Bresci, who actually came back from Italy, from Paterson, New Jersey, where he had emigrated. So that's also the time where we start to again when they associate anarchy with chaos and terrorism.
Yeah, and what this all kind of spawned from was this idea of the propaganda of the deed. That was that was the fundamental thing that took place after the Haymarket Affair of Chicago. You have the propaganda of the deed, which is a call to action that goes beyond words. It means get activated, do something about this, because they saw from that example of the Chicago, you could just say massacre from the state, that the anarchists had to stand up and do something in return and retaliate in full force, because words were not doing it anymore, and that's how they felt. So I think it was in 1891, police started shooting and murdering women and children during the May Day protest. After the, this is a repetition of this event that takes place.
Yeah.
And then we have this guy Ravachol, who uses dynamite to plant in suitcases outside the apartments of judges and the advocate general. And he was it's kind of like the V for Vendetta thing. Like, he wasn't actually killing people, he was symbolically blowing up state property is like what he was doing, as far as what I know. No deaths were ever accounted for this, but he was convicted, and this is actually where we get this idea that anarchism was terrorism, was from these acts, because he starts using nitroglycerin to like symbolically attack the state, right, through propaganda of the deed. And they even made songs about him. I think there's a song about this guy in Europe. Yes. Yeah. So he ended up.
Song about Ravachol, yes.
Yes. Yeah. And also, we have to realize that at this time, this also increases the police budget, where they start to have these anthropometric papers are produced. And anthropometric means, human characteristics. So they're examining the bodies of the dead now, and they're actually producing it in paperwork to identify what had happened. So this is some of the things that were taking place. You have this increase in budget for criminal investigation that starts from all this, which is kind of interesting how we see that anarchism, like as the state escalates, we escalate, and then they escalate more. And it's kind of like this teeter-totter thing that goes throughout history, where we're just always fighting each other, and there's like no real solution taking place.
And born from false flags also.
Yes, born from false flags. Yes, we see that going on today.
So then it escalates whether either it is something legitimately coming from anarchists or something done from who knows, infiltrators and and sting operations and the like. So
yeah. Well, there was also another thing about Ravachol. He had the 3 cries for revolution, which was cut short by the guillotine when they executed him. So he was sentenced to life in prison because of these bombings, and then they sentenced him to death eventually. And then these 3 calls for revolution acted as a call to arms for revolutionaries all over the world. And right before that, just as a brief mention, you had mentioned the Spanish Revolution and stuff like that. Well, right before that, in 1881, we have the formation of the Spanish Anarchist Federation, which is kind of interesting. So this is the kind of solidification of that kind of movement at this time period. It's taking place all over the world, obviously. The FAI played a crucial role in coordinating the anarchist activities and spreading anarchist ideas in Spain at this time period.
Similar things were happening in Italy, so there were many Italian anarchists during that time. Not only those who shot the who shot the kings and the prime ministers, but especially Enrico Malatesta was one of the most famous anarchists, very active in the post-Unitarian Italy.
Jeremiah Cassero. He's the guy who stabbed President S.E.E.D. During his visit to
Carnot, yes.
Yeah.
S.E.E.D. Carnot, the Prime Minister of France.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't. Now the name of the anarchist that did that escapes me, but it was an Italian anarchist. And yeah, the Italian government acted in conjunction with similarly to the other governments. So there was a big cry for this anarchist threat, and it's funny because that's going on today also.
Right.
Right. In the post-COVID period, there was this new sort of this new threat issued by the government that concerned all these supposed anarchist movements and anarchists in general, and you see all the usual slogans that abolish capitalism and property,
right,
and etc. etc. So I think those movements and like these anarchist social centers are all highly infiltrated, and you have to really take that with more than a grain of salt, because
yes,
whatever action comes from there, it really seems it's like a result of infiltration and sting operations mainly. When the government needs scapegoats for its agenda. So
absolutely, that's absolutely right, and that's I agree with that from my research as well.
And regarding Spain, one last thing, there was another event in Spain that was attributed to anarchists, and that led to the incarceration near Barcelona of a group of anarchists, just randomly, people randomly arrested, and the attack was actually, there was the police was behind the attack,
right?
And those people were brutally tortured, and some of them escaped and actually showed all the mutilations that they were subjected to, which led this Italian named Angiolillo to go and kill the Spanish prime minister.
Right.
So that was why he did it. So
yeah, it's interesting. We do see that kind of repeating over and over and over. And I mean, I sympathize, because this was a horrible time period. We have the rapid influx of industrialization taking place. People are in some of the most gruesome work environments with very little safety precautions. People are starving all over the place. People are struggling all over the place. I mean, I understand the urge for vengeance against, the state. I understand that. I just don't think it's a pragmatic way of getting our ideas or any kind of solution to ever come about as an anarchist, And we do see that as it moves forward, we get away from the propaganda of the deed and more into education and intellectual and philosophical education with some of the literary people of the 19th century and the 20th century of anarchism. There's still the idea of action taking place, but there's a lot of anarchists that stand against that in their writings. But the one thing I did want to mention, after the Ravachol event, we had the Dynamite Press come up, right? And that was like a servicing little magazine that came out, and it was an interesting little zine that they were producing, because they literally were teaching people how to use nitroglycerin, you know, and take it or leave it. But I'm all for people being armed, So, but it's kind of like a forefront for what we later deemed the anarchist cookbook in a way.
Yes.
It's an early idea of the anarchist cookbook, So.
Yeah, again, I know it's used to criticize anarchism. However, we have to bear in mind the the self-defense principle, one of the tenets of of natural law and of maintaining freedom.
That's right. That's absolutely right. We
have to keep that in mind, So
yes, we do advocate for self-defense, and that does mean the proper and responsible use of arms. And this is why it's so important, because we do have these types of events taking place where we see that the state is the most notorious for the most malicious activities against the individual liberty throughout time. So yeah, a lot of people, unfortunately, they were radicalized at this point, and the dynamite press was the perfect catalyst for them to be able to go out and use this knowledge of nitroglycerin, which was a new tech at that point, to bomb, to use in bombs. And this is where we get this whole idea of terrorism and anarchism coming together, because now you have the media stepping in, you have the publishing companies that are becoming much more prevalent, the newspapers, and they're propagandizing all these events, sensationalizing these things, and specifically leaving out the proper context and historical evidence of what actually was taking place. And I do believe that that's part of the control mechanism of how the media has always operated, which is interesting. And I believe, just off the top of my head, I remember researching early newspaper publications. The publishers, they were almost like a secret society at one point, and they were withholding that from the state until eventually, they got infiltrated and stuff like this. They were withholding that technology from the state. And I always thought that was kind of interesting, that they were almost like a secret society. A lot of people did deem them kind of like a clandestine society that was fighting against the state. But yeah, so we have that dynamite press that comes out, which is pretty interesting. So they also were a propaganda machine, just like the mainstream news. They were using eye-catching headlines, dramatic illustrations. They use sensational stories. We see it on both sides all the time. But they were closer to at least the truth than what the mainstream media was talking about. They actually were talking about the real issues. Let's see here. Yeah, it was an interesting time period. Things start to escalate after this, because this is pre-World War I, right? So this is like when we start to see the feminist movement start to rise up, because a lot of the wives were really upset about the working environments and their husbands being away for so long and dying in the coal mines, and and this is the oppressive force of capitalism and the inequality taking place within the working environment is a huge thing. So you see people like Emma Goldman stepping up to the plate, really talking out against this, and her student. Who was her student? Do you remember her name? Claire.
Voltairine de Cleyre.
Yeah, de Cleyre. Yes. And who was she actually had a disease and she died, unfortunately. But she was a very prominent figure in the anarchist movement as well, especially in the early 1900s. She also was a feminist, an early feminist, which I would consider classical feminism, the idea of true equality between men and women's rights, right? So we also see, this is something I want to point out, we also see how the communists and the collectivists or Marxists tend to take these ideas that we have and co-opt them into their own agenda, right? So they're like, oh, that's a great way of, getting through to the public. Let's take it and use it. They even take our own symbols, our colors, our symbols, and they use them against us. We see this all over the place. We see it with like the black cat of anarchism, right? The black and red of communism, right? And yeah, these are all original anarchist symbols, and they co-opted them, which is, I don't believe in IP, so it's whatever. My issue is that they used it against us, and they used it against free people. It's not that other people are using these symbols. It's that what they're using them for is different, the idea. So, because I don't believe in IP anyways, so yeah.
Yeah, that's right. As we said, that's quite a big issue because, and I don't know if you want to mention, anarchists of today, I guess, because I feel that, as we mentioned in the beginning, there's a lot of misunderstanding of what these anarchists in the past have said, and and again, I think many of them keep keep compromising, having this compromise with these authoritarian ideals like communism and socialism, and falling for all this these dialectics, not really understanding property and individualism. So yeah, I definitely don't have a I don't hold in high. I don't have a high regard for for today's anarchists.
Me either. I feel you with that. Yeah, the modern anarchists have definitely failed. We have Antifa. That's that tends to be like the main symbol, at least over here, of anarchism. And it's also running within the music industry with the punk movements and stuff like that, which is interesting. It does seem to be that there's a divergent ideas of anarchism where that's all branching even more and more and more into like smaller and smaller factions of differing ideologies and how they apply things. Yeah. I consider this a form of balkanization,
Yes.
Where it's balkanizing these ideas and now all of them fight with each other, And I think that's one of the issues that we have because we're not rooted in principles anymore. Not that throughout history we were solidified, especially in colloquial history, but in classical history. But you had mentioned the Interpol. I wanted to give some dates on that. So we have the Anti-Anarchist Conference, which was also known as the International Conference for the Repression of Anarchism. Was a diplomatic gathering held in Rome, Italy, from November 24th to December 21st, 1898, and it was, it was intended to repress all of the anarchistic, uprising at this time period, and there was a bunch of anarchist act all over Europe at this period, including the assassination of Empress Elizabeth of Austria by the Italian anarchists in September 1898. The International Criminal Police Commission, the ICPC, which later became known as Interpol, emerged directly from the Anti-Anarchist Conference of 1898. Following the conference in 1923, the International Criminal Police Commissions was formally established in Vienna and Austria, and then obviously they started to expand outwardly after this, especially to deal with the war on drugs, right? It was a big thing against the war on trade is really what it is. Not the war on drugs, it's the war on trade. It's the war on sovereignty and freedom of trade, freedom of exchange. So yeah, those were just some of the time periods. I wanted to give that a little clarification on when that actually took place. So yeah, I think that's really important to understand because this is where we start to see all this propaganda against terrorism. And often when you look into the history of terrorism, you're going to find most likely it's not what you think it is. It's usually freedom fighters fighting against the state in most cases. Not to say that there aren't actual radical terrorists out there that are, just as bloody as the state in some areas in the Middle East.
They are pawns ultimately.
Yes, they are pawns. Yep, absolutely. So
as we see today, there's really nothing new. Nothing new about all the war on terror and war on drugs stuff. But they keep doing it because people are, none the wiser. So
yes. You had mentioned the Russian Revolution. We we covered that pretty decently. 1905, we have the Russian Revolution, and we have the workers of the Soviets, or the Workers' Council, which was a key thing in the anarchist organizing in Russia. And this kind of led.
Well, yeah, that was one of the early. It wasn't the October Revolution of 1917. It was one of the early uprisings in Russia.
Right. And this idea kind of leads to anarcho-syndicalism, which we see today. So that's kind of a little connection there, because it evolves into anarcho-syndicalism, which is where we get the black cat symbol. So the anarcho-syndicalists use the black cat symbol and the cog, because they would throw cogs into the machine of industry, of capitalism, and they literally would do that. They would go out to the big, machine factories and throw clogs in there and then jam them up, so their idea was jam it up. It was another thing of propaganda by the deed. It was just another way of them asserting a fight back. There was a book published in 1907 called The Salvation of the Flesh is in the Deeds. And this was Gillian's, I think is his name. It was one of his influential works, and he starts these I think they are kind of like mutual aid compounds for people, where people could come and get education and stuff like that. A lot of people don't know about him, but he was pretty influential at that time. He definitely stood against the propaganda of the deed. He more spoke about education, we need to build a better man to change society. That's kind of what his whole thing was. So we, at this time period, early 1900s, we had a lot of stuff going on. You had the Mexican Revolution, you had, the Russian Revolution, we had people being assassinated by anarchists all over the place. What's his name? Duke Frank, I think, was assassinated supposedly. Is that correct? Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
No, he's an Austro-Hungarian.
You mean the Archduke?
Yes, the
Franz
Archduke.
Ferdinand. Yeah, that's in 1914. But I don't think it was. That was, what they said was the beginning of the spark that started World War One.
World War One, yeah. That's supposedly the start of what kicked off.
Yeah, supposedly,
War, but
yes, but I think the guy, the person who killed him was officially allegedly was a Serbian nationalist. I think. Yep. Gavrilo Princip, but.
He was supposedly propagandized as an anarchist, but he was a Serbian nationalist for the attack, because the Serbian nationalists had these connections with anarchism at this time period. But it wasn't directly he was an anarchist. They were just using it as a means of propaganda against it again. And then we have a very interesting attack, another one in 1914, July the 4th, 1914, in New York, Tarrytown, New York. Frank Arbano attempted to assassinate John D. Rockefeller, which is interesting, and this actually did happen. There's video footage of the aftermath of the attack, of the bombing. Fuck the Rockefellers, but, but it's interesting because nobody ever teaches you about this. They don't even teach you about you mentioned the assassination of McKinley, and they barely cover that in school, which is interesting over here anyways. So it's kind of cool. It's a cool part of history. It's not a cool event. It's just a cool part of history where it's the anarchists were attacking the Rockefeller in the early 1900s, So, and then
if they weren't a symbol of capitalism, I don't know what, or suppose that, actually was kind of, corporate monopoly, but
yes, yes, you're right. Cronyism. We call it cronyism. They're freaking cronies. Well, we have these Italian guys, Niccolo and Bart, right? We have the two Italians that were executed.
Yeah,
They were
Sacco,
arrested
Sacco
and
and
charged.
Vanzetti, yes.
Yes. Yes.
Nicola
Yes.
Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were falsely accused of murder and robbery and trial, and subsequently, executed.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And they became it was a very controversial legal dilemma over here, because they had immigrated here, and it's still used today in the history of law as an example of like the failure, because eventually they were pardoned, and they were like, oh yeah, this was not supposed to happen, right? This is what we always do, it's not supposed to happen. They tried to secure a new trial, but obviously were unsuccessful, and they were by the electric chair.
Yes. Yeah.
And
they were basically condemned mainly because they were Italians and anarchists. So
yes,
that was kind of, they were basically sentenced because of that, not because there was any type of evidence.
That's right.
So
that's absolutely right. The electric chair is kind of interesting too, right? So Edison had come out with I think it's 13 millimeter. I'm looking for my notes on it. It was either 33 or 13 millimeter camera. He also was trying to, market his new technology for the first execution. This was for McKinley, I believe.
I actually had something that I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
Maybe to close the show.
Yes, we can do that.
It's kind of an interesting question. Is according to you, what's the in anarchist thought? What gets closer to natural law and true freedom?
To me, in the modern era, not classical era, as far as like if we're looking at the totality of anarchism, I would definitely have to say there's two people who stand out currently, and I would say that the number one proponent of, that gets closest to what I would consider to be anarchism that's actually solution-oriented, grassroots-oriented, and practical is Mark Passio. I would say that he's the closest when it comes to a lot of this, because he covers the history very well. He synthesizes all the ideas into a aggregated form of a, very consistent philosophy and axiom that can be applied to the other issues. We see people, this is one thing I always see people doing. I see people trying to start from like the economic issues. It's always this economic approach, right? And if you don't get your philosophy sound first, you can't apply that to the economics, because you're completely missing your foundation of what you need to approach these other complex problems, which really don't end up being that complex if you just get out of the authoritarian mindset, really. So I'd say Mark Passio, but I have a few that I really enjoy. I like Lysander Spooner. He's a very good author. He was also a lawyer, which is interesting as an anarchist. I think Larkin Rose, he's modern, obviously. He has a lot of good things to say on anarchism and against the state. I do appreciate, as a more classical lyricist, I like Benjamin Tucker, because he does kind of branch out into dealing with social issues in many different ways. Although I feel that there's some critique that's needed for Benjamin Tucker's work. But I do think he deals with what I'm talking about, like the economics of the social structure and like how we deal with self-defense and things like that in the society. He does a really good job of laying a lot of that stuff out. And then I would say, you had already mentioned Josiah Warren. I like Josiah Warren's work. It's really interesting because there's not a lot of anarchists that talk about natural law the way that I would hope. We really rarely see that. We more see philosophers talking about natural law more so than specific anarchists, though I would consider them de facto anarchists in different ways. We see natural law coming out with like the early versions, with Epicurus and Diogenes and stuff like that, eventually evolving into John Locke John Locke and Rousseau. We have Rousseau that talks about it a little bit, though I have critiques for Rousseau in many ways. But yeah, to answer the question, Mark Passio, definitely. I would hope that eventually he would write a book on anarchism. I think he has a very powerful message when it comes to that philosophy, and he really shows what anarchism is not, which helps you to define what anarchism is. So that would be my answer on that.
Yeah, I do agree, and also I agree a lot with what you said about the people tending to come mostly only from an economic perspective, and then they say, well, let's talk about the economic aspects, because then that defines the ethical aspects. For me, it's kind of like the contrary. You go into first principles and natural law, objective morality, and then we can better the aspects of all the other aspects of society, including economic interactions. So yeah, that's one of my main critiques of some sort of those types of economic anarchists or economic thought. So yeah, well, I think that's all for today. We went about kind of almost a 2-hour episode, really packed with data, and pretty interesting. It has been great to have you back on, man, and it's a very interesting show. So yeah, thanks again for having me here.
Of course.
Yeah, if you wanna tell people where they can find your work, you also have a book coming out on this topic. So yeah, go ahead. And
very excited about that. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back here with you. Maybe we can do a second part on this, because the next, I really do feel that the next part is when you really see anarchism kind of decline in many ways. Like it's really interesting, and we see why we're in the current condition that we're in the mainstream anarchism. So yeah, you can find my work at seedtruth.com. That's SEEDTRUTH.com. You can also find it at the onegreatworknetwork.com. And my name is Brandon Martin. So all you have to do is go to the creator tab at the One Great Work Network, and you'll find my work there and my link to my main website, which is seedtruth.com. And in my book, I am working on it is about the history of anarchism. And I mean, it's going to be good. As far as right now, the name of it is Rebels Against the State, Anarchist Philosophy and Its Origins. And it's going to be pretty in-depth. I'm trying to keep it non-biased. So I'm trying to approach it without applying too many of my ideas, just a template of the ideas through history. But then in the last chapters, I will be talking about modern anarchism, where I see anarchism going. Is there hope for anarchism? Stuff like this, why I'm an anarchist. And also, my critiques of everything throughout the book. So the final chapters will be my critiques and my perspective on everything. But everything leading up to that is just like, this is how it went down, just me non-biased. This is how it is, which every once in a while I do have to add a couple things in there, obviously. I'm like, this can't stand, but it's really hard to do that. It's hard to write a book from a non-biased. Yes. And not be like, what is this? But yes, I hope to get that out sometime this year. I'm on the last 3 chapters, so be looking for that. It will be on my website. And since I'm an anarchist, it will be eventually up for free on PDF on the website for download as well, because I want everybody to have this information, and I don't want people, especially children, to be kept from this. So
awesome. And yeah, if people can also maybe buy a physical copy. So they can, support the war effort.
That's right.
And,
that's right. It helps. Every purchase that's made on my site goes directly into upgrading my content, my equipment, and making sure I can maintain this type of work, which is difficult when we are, when inflation is so bad, when we have so much immoral apparatuses just destroying individual liberty all around us. It's hard to stay consistent for a lot of people to be like, oh yeah, I can actually do this work. They get us into survival mechanisms, and it kind of sucks. So any kind of donation or purchases, I very much appreciate. And I very much appreciate that whoever the listening audience is, thank you for paying attention and thank you for putting your time here. And hopefully you share and like this and share some of this information with other people.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, we're at the end. See you all next time.